Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the March 13th edition of Farm Office Live. I'm David Marison, and I'll serve as the moderator to kick off today's program. I'd like to welcome you here on a little bit chillier day across the state of Ohio. On the lineup that you see for today's program, we're going to begin with what's happening with data centers across Ohio, as well as a really good and timely legislative update. And then we're going to have a special guest talking about the impact of the Iran conflict on agriculture, which will then move nicely into Barry Ward talking about our crop input outlook and maybe some changes to our fertilizer and fuel line items on our budgets. And then we'll wrap up today giving a quick update on the federal farm program as well as some upcoming program and events, especially our online workshops and courses that are available for you as producers. Again, we have aboard today our farm office team, and I'd like to welcome everybody here this morning. And I mentioned that we have a special guest, and the special guest is going to be Dr. Ian Sheldon, professor in Anderson's Chair of Agriculture Marketing, Trade, and Policy from our Department of Agriculture, Environmental, and Development Economics. But you know that we're always up for something new on Farm Office Live, and today is something going to be different on Farm Office Live with the fact that we knew it was really important to talk about this Iran conflict and the impact on agriculture. But Ian right now is somewhere across the Midwest in a plane. So we've done something we haven't done before, which is record Ian's session, and you're going to be seeing that later today. And then, as I mentioned, it will move nicely into Barry's presentation on the input outlook. Just a reminder that the slides and recording of today's webinar, as with all our previous webinars, can be found at go.osu.edu/farm office live. Just go ahead and we'll put that link right into the chat for you so you're able to go access those slides. Again, as soon as we get the recording, we'll post that recording. So if you want to share it along to some of your friends, or if you just want to rewatch it, you're more than welcome to do that. And just as far as one last housekeeping item, feel free to drop your questions that you have into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So just put the question and answers. We'll try to answer that real time or behind the scenes. And know that we try to reserve that chat function feature of the Zoom webinar to be able to drop you links. And those are the links that you can access right there. We're appreciative Bruce Clevenger is kind of wrangling all the chats today. And again, just a reminder, here is our lineup for today. And we're going to just turn it over right to Robert Moore. Robert's going to lead and moderate the discussion as we move into what's happening with the Ohio data centers. So, Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, David. So when the legal team was discussing what topic we wanted to address for this month's Farm Office Live, we were like, well, what's kind of the hottest topic in the legal world? And in Ohio, anyway, that's probably data centers. So we thought we would just kind of have a discussion instead of a more formal slide presentation because Peggy and Ellen have quite a bit of expertise in this area. So I'm just going to kind of moderate, ask some questions, and if you have any questions, feel free to join in as well. So Peggy and Ellen, I do mostly estate planning and business stuff and farm production stuff. I don't know a lot about data centers. So for people like me, what is a data center? And in the context of just, ordinary everyday language, but then also, is there a difference in how the state legislature is in the process of defining data centers?
Sure. I'll start out with that, Robert. If you think of it from a layman's term, from what we all know as we drive back and forth to Columbus, I see data centers all the time. They're these very large buildings that contain electronic information systems that are gathering and processing and transmitting data in all sorts of ways, a lot of networking equipment. If you look at pictures of them, you'll see inside those buildings there are a lot of kind of cages and different modules within that structure that are all basically focused on accumulation of electronic information. That's, I think, the layman's explanation. But when you start looking at laws, there are different types of definitions, and I think the distinction comes in size. What's the size of that facility? Some are defined in terms of how much electricity they consumed. And so you'll see some laws that apply only to those larger types of buildings that are doing that kind of communications processing. And if they're consuming over a certain amount, they could be defined as a data center for the purpose of a specific law. But then not all laws have that electricity um, component to them. Some of them just define them as I said, facilities that are processing data. So there's variation in the legal definitions.
And I wanted to add, Peggy, in the layman's terms too, I guess the way I think about it, it's not all that they do, but they're any anything you have in the cloud, anything related to cloud computing is happening in data centers. So that's the kind of
Yes,
data.
that's a good point. What I've learned is I've looked around to try to understand how many data centers we have in Ohio, is that sometimes what is a portion of a facility is considered to be a data center because that portion of the building is, as you said, doing that type of processing and transmission. So it doesn't have to be an entire facility even to be considered a data center.
It sounds like that might be hard to track because it could be a room in an office building or a small building, or it could be one of these, mammoth buildings outside of Columbus, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So we've all heard about data centers and, you know, how they're being the concern with them, but I'm not sure I fully understand what is the concern. What is the negative impacts that we should be looking at and evaluating?
Right. So there's several and a lot of them, because we don't know the long-term impacts, are kind of, we're guessing at what they might be. But I know for, especially for an agricultural audience, um, there's a worry about land use and using prime farmland for these to build these data centers. Um, there has been testimony, Farm Bureau has testified for some of these data center builds, and they've brought up that issue in particular, that they're worried about land use and taking away from agriculture. Some of the long-term impacts that we don't know about yet are there's a possibility, people have raised the possibility of air quality problems. These centers also use a lot of water for cooling the computers and the um, different components. Um, it could be up to 5 million gallons a day, which is like a small city usage. And I know that's a big worry. Um, Other issues are, in certain communities, a lot of testimony on these bills in the legislature, people have brought up that they weren't aware that the data centers were going in, and then all of a sudden that decision was made and there was no real feedback from the community. I know that's a concern for people too. Another, like one of the biggest things is um, people are worried about the cost of electricity and whether that will be passed on to normal people like you and me. The amount of electricity that the data centers are using. Um, whether we're going to end up paying for that kind of thing in the long term too.
And they require upgraded transmission, and I think that's
Yeah.
another part of that concern about electricity costs. Are they going to shift those upgrades onto residential and other taxpayers, different classes? That's
And at the
definitely a concern.
at the moment, there are incentives for data centers to come to Ohio. They get tax incentives. So it's kind of balancing that and, are people are wondering, are they really paying their fair share?
And another issue I think related to what Alan said is there was a bill passed last year, Senate Bill 15, and that allows behind the meter generation. And so some of them are now able to have their own on-site power generation, and yet there doesn't seem to be a pathway for regulating that on-site power generation. And so people are pretty nervous about seeing a data center come in that's proposing to use, for example, the fuel cells or diesel uh, generation. There are all types of generation. There's one that was recently announced that will tie into the two nuclear plants in
Mhm.
Ohio. And so I think there's some nervousness too about what is the impact of allowing them to basically control their own energy generation without any type of oversight, as you would see if you were going through PUCO or the Power Siting
Mhm.
Board. It's another concern.
Another issue, and I'm not sure how much it's been studied, but along with water usage, I know Farm Bureau raised in their testimony the possibility of water pollution when they discharge this water back into the waters of the state. It would be heated up, and that we're not sure what other kinds of things might be part of that. So,
And I think you too have to raise the kind of economic impact question
mhm.
because some people are frustrated that these are touted as economic impact, but it appears from what I've learned that most of that economic impact comes in the construction. There are quite a few construction jobs generated to build a data center, but then after construction, it really falls off to a much smaller number of people. The largest data centers, from what I've learned, employ about 50 people, and some of the smaller ones might employ only one or two. And so I think people are frustrated that they're treating this as, oh, it's going to add all these jobs, but it's temporary because most of the jobs will be in construction.
Are we talking about, at least for the big project, is this the Amazons, Googles, Microsofts of the world? Is that,
Facebook,
you know,
yeah.
yeah, okay. Um, is Ohio unique? Are other parts of the country facing the same dilemma, or is Ohio somewhat unique in this? What kind of pressure is there throughout the country?
We are. We're in the top five for data center development in Ohio, and we're just slightly behind Chicago right now in the Midwest as the top data center hub, but we're expected to pass Chicago. We've already passed New York. We're expected to pass Chicago because there are about 80 data centers still in the proposal stage that will be coming, and that will put us somewhere that, the numbers are hard to confirm because of this definition issue. How, are we talking all data centers as far as even just a portion of a facility? Or are we talking the entire facility? So the numbers vary, but I do see pretty consistently that we're around that 200 data center mark in Ohio with more to come. So that makes us, as I said, top five in the nation for data center development. And most of that's around
So,
Columbus. About half of that is around
Yeah,
Columbus.
Central Ohio.
so I guess it depends. Is top five a good thing or not? I guess it depends on your perspective, right? Whether
True.
you work for Google or you are in the farming community. Um, so let's talk about some legislation. I know there's several bills that are in the works. So why don't we talk about that? And generally, how is our legislature approaching this? Do you know yet? Or do they tend to be more pro data center, anti data center, or do we know yet?
Sure, I'm going to put up a slide that we've prepared that shows you what's currently proposed in Ohio. And Ellen, you want to start
Yeah.
on that? Is that good?
Yeah. So, there are currently five bills, and I just read this morning that the Democrats in the General Assembly are looking at introducing even more bills regarding data centers and kind of guardrails for that. But the first bill, and we've been following this, I think we talked about it last Farm Office Live, is the Data Center Study Commission. And that has recently passed out of committee, but they did make some changes to it
Want
out
me
of
to show that
committee.
slide, Ellen? I
Yeah.
can, okay, advance to
I don't,
that.
is that the way you wanted to do it or?
Sure, let's go ahead and do that. Just to give you a general landscape here, you can see that there are a number of bills proposed. So the General Assembly is trying to respond to some of these issues, and now we'll go into I'll change the slides, Ellen, as you talk a
Okay.
little bit more about
Sorry
each
about that.
one.
Yeah, so this has recently changed the language of this bill as it goes to the House floor to be considered. Um, Before, when we talked about it, the makeup of this commission to study data centers and report back to the governor and the General Assembly didn't have a lot of requirements for membership and who would be put on to that commission. Um, the new language would, as you can see here, would um, have a specific, make people with specific expertise they want on the commission. So, notably, they'd want somebody from agriculture, from county government, somebody who knows about the water and environmental impacts of data centers, and then um, local governments, public utilities, and that kind of thing. And beforehand, there was no specific, I guess, requirement for who specifically would be on the commission. And
Right,
this kind of names that out. So,
right. The good thing about this bill is it would require that report in 6 months. So
mhm.
trying to speed up gathering that information and getting something out that the legislature can continue to work on. I like that part of it. And I'll talk about the next one, which is the non-disclosure agreements. This would not be unique to data centers. It would be to any type of situation that involves county commissioners, trustees, mayors. Those types of local officials would be prohibited under this bill, House Bill 695, from entering into any type of non-disclosure agreement. There have been communities that have been pretty frustrated to learn that that was going on, and that's why they got that late notice that, hey, we're getting a data center. The officials already knew about it, but they had signed non-disclosure agreements saying that they would not share that information. And so this would prohibit that type of action and impose a fine and void the agreement.
And
How about the next one,
Shempa,
Ellen?
I'm curious about that one.
Mm-hmm.
Why are there non-disclosure? Is it because the Amazons of the world are afraid that if it's disclosed, they lose some competitive advantage? Or I just think that's
I think that's a
strange.
good I think that's a good question, and I don't have an exact answer for that, but I think you raise a good guess that there is some potential harm to that data center developer if that information is out, whether it's pushback from the community or whether it's something else, like you're saying, competition. I'm not sure. Ellen, have you seen anything that suggests why they are using these so
I
heavily?
mean, no, but I think what Robert said is a good guess based on testimony I've heard from people in these communities. So
Yeah.
And
So,
somebody just put in the chat, perhaps the cost of land.
yeah.
Perhaps you're right. Because yeah, maybe price of the land just went up if word got out. So yeah.
right. And we didn't talk a lot about tax impacts, but a lot of tax deals are being made on these. And that
Mhm.
could be another thing that they have to keep quiet in order to get those incentives that they're seeking. I don't know. Could be a lot going on there. Okay, how about the next one?
Yeah, so this one they're kind of dubbing a tariff on data centers, and basically at the moment in central Ohio, this is already happening with AEP, um, that they are requiring data center customers to guarantee that they will use this amount of electricity, that they can pay for it, in order to kind of protect other customers, like individuals and small businesses, farms, that kind of thing. So,
And that AEP case actually was a case brought against AEP to make sure in Ohio Power OPP um, to ensure that they weren't shifting the cost onto other ratepayers. And what came out of that was a settlement agreement that AEP willingly entered into to say, okay, here's how we'll handle this. We'll basically kind of set this tariff on the data center. And that's the model that these sponsors are trying to incorporate now into this bill that, okay, others need to do
right.
what AEP is doing. But AEP's been hit pretty hard by these since they're in central
Central
Ohio,
Ohio.
so many are looking at how AEP is handling this.
So this would expand it statewide if passed. And like I said, you know, if the data center weren't able to make the payments, it would kind of bake in assurances for that.
So avoiding that cost shifting to other ratepayers. How about 710, Ellen? What have you learned about that one? Kind of
Um,
an interesting mix of things
yeah.
going on in this one, I think.
So basically, this would require, it would not allow land to be taken um, eminent domain for a public use. It would say that data centers are not a public use, and therefore they wouldn't be able to be taken by a government entity. Land wouldn't be able to be taken by a government entity to be used as a new data center. Um, the and it also bakes in um, kind of that protection for other customers, that data centers must prove to PUCO that the electric load, that they can cover it and it won't add to the costs of other customers. And then it specifically points out, and I think this is um, tied to the takings type argument, that data centers can be constructed on prime farmland, but that farmland must be voluntarily sold. Um, so it would kind of disallow the taking of prime farmland for data centers. And I think it just reiterates what it says at the beginning of the bill, you know, data centers are not a public use and we're not going to take land for this reason.
And then the last one is on the sales tax exemption issue. Uh, Governor DeWine vetoed a provision in the budget bill last year that would have prohibited sales tax exemptions for data centers. This bill might not need to continue because the House has already indicated that it's considering overriding that veto, and that would allow sales tax, or that would prohibit sales tax exemptions. But if that override doesn't occur, this bill could come in that would just eliminate that sales tax exemption, but not until October of 2027. So a lot of those that are already under proposal could probably still get in with that sales tax exemption. They'd have a year and a half. So I think the preferred route of many would be let's just override the veto and eliminate the sales tax exemption.
Mhm. Yeah, I thought that date was interesting. I'd like to know more about how they came to that decision, but
Hmm.
like, so
So those are the
Well,
bits and pieces that are in there right now, Robert. But as we said, there could be more coming.
sure there will be more coming. So we better wrap up. But first, there is a question. What is the impact of a closed loop water system? I don't know if either of you are able to answer that. You would just practically you would think it would be a good idea, but
I
I
don't
guess
know if
we're
it's
not in.
possible. The little bit that I've read about that is that it requires a lot more energy to cool that water back down to
mhm.
reuse it. So
Mhm.
you might be addressing the water, the discharge of heated water because that water is hot because it's cooling all those machines down. So you'd be addressing that, but you'd be increasing the energy usage because you're trying to cool that water back down so that you can reuse it.
Okay. All right.
That's all
Any
I know
final
about it.
makes sense. Any final thoughts before we move on?
I
Just
think
that,
there's just
well,
gonna
oh, go ahead, Ellen.
I think there's just gonna be, it sounds like there's more legislation that's gonna be introduced about these, so it's not gonna go away.
And
And
we're
you're on
tracking
top
it
of it,
as
right?
best we can.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for all the comments, and I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more about data centers on Farm Office Live and uh, other sources through Farm Office. So, with that, we're going to wrap up. I think, Barry, are you next?
No, we have a few more slides, Robert, on
Oh,
legislation. So
okay.
much,
Sorry.
that's okay. We have the rest of our legislative update. We just combined those together.
Ah,
So
okay.
the
I'm going to
data
turn it over to
center,
you.
okay, the data center bills are a large part of our legislative update, but we also have a few other bills we want to update you about. Now, right now, there is a lot of activity going on down at the Ohio legislature, a lot of committee meetings. They just announced more committee meetings next week, and some of the bills we've been following will have hearings in those meetings. So there's a lot that's just in process. So what we want to focus on, though, are the ones that we think are pretty close to becoming final and being enacted. So we just have a couple of those that we want to alert you to. And next month, we'll be doing a much bigger roundup of the activity that occurs here in the next few weeks as March comes to a close. The legislature goes on a break in April, so we'll be able to catch you up with where everything stands at that point next month on Farm Office Live. But here's what we know so far about, or here's what we think is either moving or dead. Do you want to talk about this one, Ellen, the property tax package, or do you want me to do
Yeah,
that one?
so I know that at least House Bill 420, which would prohibit new continuous levies from being placed on the ballot, it had its first hearing um in committee. But since then it has been removed from the agenda for a second hearing, along with these other two in the trilogy that we talked about last time. have been removed from the agenda. And from what I've read and what I'm hearing is there's not a lot of momentum um, to move these forward. The Speaker of the House has indicated that he doesn't think that they will go anywhere until at least after the summer break. So we'll keep our eye on these, but I don't think they're moving anywhere anytime soon.
Seem to be dead for the moment.
Yeah.
The ones that are moving are the carbon capture bill. You've heard me report on that several times. It's taken quite a while to get to the current bill that we have, and that bill is getting closer. It had a second hearing in the Senate Energy Committee. If you recall, this one has already passed the House, House Bill 170, and there was a hearing last week with only, I believe, Farm Bureau was the only party that testified as an interested party. There was no opponent testimony. And so we expect that when that is called up for its next hearing, it will probably be reported out of committee. The only issue that I see there that there seems to be continued interest in possibly changing is that pooling provision that forces landowners into a project against their will. There's a percentage there of landowners that that developer would have to have consent from in order to use the pooling provisions. And that's currently at 70%, which puts us, I think, pretty good compared to other states have lower numbers. So we're on the high end of that pooling requirement. But in that last committee hearing, there was some talk about maybe it needs to go up to 75%. So that could change in the next hearing. So we'll keep an eye on that and let you know what happens with that. We do expect it to be voted out and sent to the Senate floor. And then the other one, whoops, there we go. The other one that's moving is the Micro Enterprise Home Kitchens bill, the Food Freedom Bill that we've reported on previously. And that one had its second hearing March 3rd. I was surprised that it didn't come back right away the following week for a third hearing, but we expect that it will get that third hearing. It's changed significantly from the very first time I reported on it way back when it was introduced in the House. And so we'll be writing a thorough explanation of the substitute bill that the Senate is now looking at that was substituted in the House and the provisions that were added. You see there in the final bullet, much of the change came with that, adding some provisions about custom meat processing that they decided to roll into this bill. So we're keeping an eye on that, and we'll be explaining the full bill as the Senate deals with its final hearing and probably a vote out of committee and onto the Senate floor. And I think that's all we have. As we've said before, follow our legislation. We're constantly writing blog posts on legislation and trying to keep Ohio agriculture updated on the bills down there at the General Assembly that we think impact us. So thanks, everyone, and back to you, David.
Thank you, Peggy. If you would stop share, I'm going to try to make
I
sure I can
will.
share my sound. Okay. This will be a new adventure for us today, the fact that we are going to show a recording, so I want to make sure that the sound is right. And right now, I don't believe the sound is working yet, but just give me a second. As we troubleshoot this, give me a second. All that will fail when you go live because it was working earlier and now my screen share is not allowing me to do the sound. So just hang tight for just 1 second, see what we can come up with.
Sorry, David, I don't know how to help you.
Yeah.
Anyone on the team knows how to Remedy, please jump in.
I could try, but that would mean that mine would share and yours wouldn't. I don't know if that's true. I've got the video up.
Okay, if you want to try, Barry, that would be good. My sound is blocked right now.
Mine as well. For some reason, I think the previous sharing probably has allowed that or not allowed it.
So maybe we'll pivot and while I work out our video with our special guest, Barry, if you want to go ahead and share your fertilizer and your
Sure.
input outlook, and I will check to see what's going on here behind the scenes.
Okay. All right. Yes. Thanks, David. And all of my remarks were with the plan that I was going to follow Ian, so this will be a little bit different, but I have some thoughts that we're going to build on some of the things that he was going to talk about in discussing some of the trade issues and, of course, all of the things that are going on in the Middle East. I'm not sure. I took a straw poll of an audience earlier this week about what they preferred to call this operation or excursion, or I think that we've graduated to maybe this being a war. Okay, did you get this taken care of, David? Still no? All right. I will go ahead and share my slides and we'll have a conversation. It's good to see so many of you with us and a lot of familiar names. Hopefully you are going to survive this extremely windy day today. From what I understand, it's going to be a pretty bad one. At least there's no snow or rain that go with it. Okay, I'm going to talk about some issues that I normally talk about, and that's looking at crop input costs and margins as we evaluate things now in the light of, and everything's against the backdrop of what's going on really in the Middle East right now, because it has affected us in terms of not only personally and looking at some of the costs that we're having to manage, but also some of the things that are going to impact us, at least in the short term and maybe longer term throughout this production period in terms of input costs. And specifically, we're going to look at crops, not really going to face livestock, although as we look at this and I talk a bit about input or commodity costs, grain prices later on, it will impact and filter through the livestock sector as well. Okay, I'm going to talk about the big issue, and if you've been paying attention to the news, it's impossible to avoid in the last couple of weeks, and that's the ups and downs in the oil market. Because many of you, if you haven't paid attention to the impacts on businesses and farm businesses in particular, you've had to buy gas at the station. So here was last night's oil price and the close of West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. price of oil effectively, and it's come down a little bit this morning from that particular point of about $95 a barrel in reference or in comparison before all of this took place in the ongoing invasion of Iran or the operation, whatever you want to call it. We were hovering right around $48 a barrel. So that's just a comparison that we're looking at. And now, whether or not we do have or find a solution in the coming weeks, as the administration continues to hope for, I think, and tell us, we may see some settling back down to that prior benchmark. But I'm a little skeptical. I think the longer this goes on, the longer it's going to take for this price of oil to settle back to this pre-war price point. Okay, so that's one of the big issues. We're going to talk about some other ones here. The Energy Information Administration had their recent update on their modeling for U.S. energy costs in the various different pieces and parts that we pay attention to. So if you look here in this slide, you can see in 2026, looking forward into in the whole of 2026, what is the expectation in terms of the price of a barrel of oil? I just showed you right now it's trading a little bit above $90 a barrel. Their expectation is around $73 a barrel for average. Now, this is based on what they knew a couple of days ago. Just to show you in comparison where we were last month in their modeling for U.S. energy markets, 2026, they were predicting around $53 a barrel. So a big jump in just 1 month based primarily on what's going on in the Middle East. Now, this is all short term, of course. Now, that's the U.S. imported price. Gas and diesel both have jumped up considerably as compared to where we were last month. This is not news to you, no, right? We know that these energy markets have gone pretty volatile. Natural gas, however, is held fairly steady. We do produce, and we are mostly energy secure when it comes to natural gas. And that was a question that I had this week as well. We're producing more oil. Why is our price really so volatile? Since and for the most part, we are energy independent. Well, we do import a lot of refined products, and these oil markets and these energy markets are global markets. So when price points go up in the Middle East, which is an important part globally in terms of energy exports, imports, pricing, it's going to affect all of our prices here at home. So that's just to show you in comparison to where we were last month. Here's the propane price, and we were expecting propane price to be mostly lower in 2026 as compared to last year, and we were hovering down here around 65 cents a gallon for wholesale, but now that has peaked up over 75 cents, and it's settled a little bit lower. Natural gas prices, just to show you in comparison, we've got here on the left-hand side, this is a U.S. natural gas price versus on the right-hand side, the European natural gas price. So very volatile in Europe and much more subject to this volatility that's occurring as a fallout from what's going on in the Middle East, and the U.S. price much more stable. Okay, so what are we looking at in terms of crop input costs, and what's this mean to us down at the farm gate? One of the things that I'll just mention ahead of time before I get into kind of ticking down through these is that many producers through the late summer, early fall, on into the fall, and now into the winter have locked in a lot of prices. So that's good for us at the farm gate and those that are raising crops. However, there's still there's still a lot of these inputs that are left unpriced and still have to be priced between now and planting. Seed costs, most of those have been locked in. Producers, for the most part, don't have to worry about too many shocks as it relates to some of the effects of the Middle Eastern conflict right now. Flat to modestly higher. Most of these are the same as what I shared last month. However, one of the things that looks like might be affected is interest rates. With some of the things that we're seeing in terms of the Fed and activities and their outlook for the rest of this year, we may be, instead of 2 or 3 rate cuts that we were expecting the last couple of months, we may be settling down to maybe at the most 1 rate cut. So it's going to probably mean interest rates that are going to be holding a little bit more steady than what we expected. The rest of these are essentially the same as what we shared the last couple of months. Big changes, however, as far as farm gate prices of energy. You saw me share those costs, and especially gas and diesel, those direct use products, and propane as well, which went from a lower price point projected to more flat for this year. Diesel price, we're plugging in around $3 a gallon right now for farm gate diesel, which is probably a little bit optimistic compared to what we're looking at in terms of on-road diesel. And then we subtract the tax for what we're actually using on the farm. That price is probably going to be a little bit closer to right now around $3.50 a gallon. However, with some cost averaging with product that's already been purchased and in storage, and then perhaps hopefully later on a little settling of these energy markets, plugging in right now around $3 a gallon, maybe optimistic. These prices have jumped across the board on fertilizer at the retail level, and the big jumps, at the ports. The urea price at the Port of New Orleans jumped up over $550 a ton. And those prices continue to to increase. So we're seeing a lot of volatility out of the Middle East, a lot of urea, a lot of product coming out of that region that's been disrupted. Shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz also disrupted. So all of these issues are going to be a concern going forward into the rest of the spring for product that's not been priced yet. So we know a lot of producers have applied or stored or locked in prices for future delivery at this point, but there's still a fair amount of fertilizer that's not priced. It might shift some usage. It might shift what we're looking at in terms of crop mix. Here's essentially my same slide as I shared last month in terms of the key fundamentals that are going to impact fertilizer prices in the near and the more intermediate term as I see it. And the overriding factor is the geopolitical disruption going on in the Middle East impacting these fertilizer prices, especially nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers. Okay, so the other factor that's going on that's not been discussed a whole lot is the increases in crop prices. Okay, so we've seen commodity prices in general go up globally, and fertilizer prices have gotten a lot of the highlight. However, we look at corn, soybean, and wheat prices, and we look at the futures prices as compared to the day before this war started, and you can see I've got February 27th as that date, and then as far as closes yesterday, pretty big bumps in December corn futures as well as November soybean futures. Wheat futures were up more strongly and they've fallen back a little bit. So those are July wheat futures. Big increases since the middle of last month. So what does that mean for our budgets? Well, I'll end with these three slides. We plugged in around 450 for corn. You're going to get a little higher price point for fall delivery at terminals, a little lower at some of our country elevators. And generally speaking, we're still looking about the same profit picture. We plugged in higher fertilizer prices on nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, big jumps since the last couple of weeks. So those bottom lines still at trend line yield for Ohio corn at 190 bushel still returns to labor and management are negative. It's not great prospects for us for lower or for higher yielding scenarios and better weather conditions. If we have these ideal weather conditions, then we can find some profitability. Soybeans have really looked and peaked up a lot at 11.25 soybeans, and this is going to look a little bit better at crush plants around Western Ohio in terms of price point. But this is showing up as more of an advantage, and we may start to see some marginal acres or those acres at the margin where producers don't have all of their decisions made shift over to soybeans. So wheat continues to look a little bit in third place as it typically is. This doesn't include any straw or double crop returns, which can make wheat acres look tremendous and in some cases much better than our corn or soybean acre profitability. So this is where we're at. And just a reminder, commodity prices have elevated, fertilizer and our grain prices. So we're still left with some challenges this year. David?
Great. Thanks, Barry.
Any luck?
Yeah, I think we are ready to go. So it's a little technology difficulty behind the scenes after we multiple shares, but I think we're good to go. And folks, I'm going to turn it over to, myself and Ian Sheldon to talk about the Iran conflict.
We are very excited to tape a short segment here with Dr. Ian Sheldon, who's the professor and Anderson's Chair of Agriculture, Marketing, Trade, and Policy for the Department of Agriculture, Environmental, and Development Economics at The Ohio State University. Dr. Sheldon is also an affiliated faculty member of the Farm Financial Management and Policy Institute. And our farm office team felt it really important that we talk to Dr. Sheldon because of the most recent conflict that has begun with Iran. We look back as we close the month of February. I think on February 28th actually is when the joint U.S. and Israeli military operations began against Iran. I know we can bounce back to Ian, back to we had a little 12-day war some tensions in that region back in June of 2025, and here we are now in the direct exchange of fire between Iran, Israel, and the U.S. So we are so appreciative of you taping this. I know you'll be travel status on Friday, so we wanted to make sure here on Farm Office Live that we are able to kind of pivot and to talk about this a little bit, so our producers out across the state of Ohio can learn more about this conflict. So given this conflict, what are some of the key economic issues that are going to be facing U.S. farmers?
Sure. Thanks, David, for inviting me to do this. I appreciate flexibility to do this via taping. It's interesting that I've spent most of the last 18 months talking about tariffs. So it's quite nice to actually talk about something different, although I think most of us would rather this conflict wasn't actually happening in terms of the impact that it's having on the economy in general, the global economy. So I think the bottom line is if any of your listeners, viewers, either read the major financial press or follow the news. I mean, even the talk show hosts were talking about this issue this morning because it's very clear that the conflict has led to Iran closing down this waterway called the Strait of Hormuz, which lies directly off their landmass. If you look at a map of the Middle East, and then that leads out eventually into the Arabian Sea. So this is a major transport link between the Persian Gulf and the rest of the world. I think about 80 to 100 ships, vessels, typically oil tankers, are moving through that strait on a daily basis. Well, they were. And right now, I think I heard this morning that only 2 vessels have gone through in the last couple of days. One of these was one of the unmarked vessels that is, quote, illegally trading sanctioned Iranian oil. And I think the other one was a Chinese vessel. And I know the president has talked about helping provide insurance and protection, but I think the shipping industry has made a very clear decision to protect its vessels and those crews against most likely these drone attacks that the Iranians have been utilizing against various other countries in this part of the world. So necessarily, the big story is obviously about oil prices. And yesterday morning, those oil prices hit over $100 a barrel, and I think they went up nearly to $120 a barrel. And that's the first time we've broken the psychological barrier of $100 a barrel since the initial invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Obviously, Russia, a major supplier of liquid natural gas and oil to the Europeans, that led to a big spike in oil prices. That price softened just a little bit yesterday because the G7 countries, which would include the United States and the European Union, were having talks about releasing oil reserves, and that led to prices falling just a little bit. And then the president's announcement late yesterday afternoon that he believed the war was going to be fairly short in terms of time did result in the oil price dropping back below $90 a barrel. But I guess, in terms of a comment you made before we came on air here, was that who knows what's going to happen to the oil price between me speaking now in this discussion and what might happen between now and Friday. I mean, this morning, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth announced that today was going to be the heaviest military, airstrikes against Iranian targets. So who knows what's going to happen to the oil price today. I did see the stock market was showing slight drops again from after the recovery that it showed late yesterday afternoon. So I think announcements by the administration, what the G7 and what the United States might do to its oil reserves, whether they release them or not, is going to be very important in terms of what's going to happen to oil prices over the next few days. But it's obvious that this is already filtered into gasoline prices at the pump here in the United States. Remember that oil is priced on a global market, and so that affects refining costs here in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So we've already seen here in Columbus, I filled up my spouse's car over the weekend, and gas prices were probably 40, 50 cents higher per gallon than they were. So I think farmers who presumably purchase mostly diesel will be seeing an increase in those pump prices if this war continues. I don't know how many of them store diesel on farm, but obviously thinking about when to purchase diesel is going to matter as we enter the planting season. So the oil price and the implications for the economy, I mean, we're already talking about if these oil prices continue at this kind of level, the expected rate of inflation is probably going to jump up to about 4% relative to where we are right now. So that's going to affect producer prices in the economy as well as the prices that consumers face. And that's presumably going to feed through into other costs that farmers face in terms of transportation of chemicals to the farm or what have you. So I think this is probably the first thing that we need to talk about or have talked about is oil prices. But I think it's interesting that not only does a lot of oil come out through this strait, but also fertilizers. And I think that's probably the piece of the story that farmers, as well as needing to know about what's happening to their energy costs, is going to really matter to their bottom line in terms of both supplies and prices.
Yeah, and Ian, you talk about that, about oil and gas and how much maybe on-farm storage we have for diesel, and every individual farm is going to be a little bit different on their pre-purchasing of fuel. But you mentioned that the fertilizer, and I think a lot of Americans, a lot of Ohioans, we're getting a revisit on our geography and knowing our world map and seeing what does it mean. I think for many, the Strait of Hormuz is something that might be a new term. We had to look on the map to find out where it is. You already talked about how it's impacted our oil and gas prices, and then of course how that affects the gas that we're putting into our vehicles, our diesel into our tractors. But why is this closure so important when it comes to this international side of fertilizer?
Yeah, this is, even I had to get up to speed on this and check my maps over the last 48 hours, not just in preparation to talk to you, but local radio stations have already got a hold of my name. So it's interesting to get up to speed on this. I mean, I did do research on the fertilizer industry early in my career, but that was very UK centered, and a lot has changed since the late 1980s. So 5 countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, account for about a third of globally traded urea. So urea is a nitrogen fertilizer. It's a substitute for the other major nitrogen fertilizer, which would be ammonium nitrate. And I'll talk a little bit about the feedstock and inputs that are necessary to produce urea, because that's related to this whole issue. It's interesting. There was a report on the Farm Policy Daily News yesterday that said that since 2020, these 5 countries have exported $50 billion worth of urea to the world market. So we're talking about 5 countries, about $10 billion worth a year. So that's a significant portion of the value of globally traded urea, and $5 billion of that was in imports over those 5 years by the United States. So even though the United States produces its own nitrogen fertilizers, we're still a net importer. So we are highly dependent on what's going on in the world market, what happens to world prices for urea and other fertilizers. I'll talk about phosphate towards the end of our discussion today. We actually import 51% of our urea from Qatar, and all of that has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is they've shut down the export of supplies, and the Persian Gulf as a geographic area is really central to the system of producing predominantly urea fertilizer, but also, as I mentioned earlier, phosphate fertilizer. So first of all, to make urea, and I'm not a chemical engineer, but in some of my research right now, I'm actually looking at what's going on in Europe in relation to the fertilizer industry. That has nothing to do with what's going on here, but so to make an ammonium or a nitrogen-based fertilizer, first of all, you need a major feedstock, and that feedstock is typically natural gas. And natural gas is about 95% methane. And the natural gas is obviously produced in this part of the world along with oil. So natural gas is a readily available input to these major producers in the Persian Gulf. Without going into the technical details, that eventually gets turned into ammonia, and that ammonia is then turned into either urea or ammonium nitrate, which are the two predominant nitrogenous fertilizers. And there have been very significant capital investments, particularly in countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, in both the production of ammonia, which is you get basically from producing, getting natural gas out of the ground, as well as urea capacity. And so they have a significant share, not just of traded nitrogen fertilizer, but they also trade liquid natural gas, which is used by the fertilizer industries outside of the Persian Gulf. So, for example, India, which is obviously another important agricultural producer, it imports quite a lot of liquid natural gas from the Persian Gulf as a feedstock for its own urea plant operations. And so basically, there are going to be delays to the shipment of ammonia, which is an input, liquid natural gas, which is an input to produce ammonia, and then the urea itself. And Qatar Energy, this is one of this, they run the largest single urea plant in the world. They shut down. They've shut down their plant because they had to shut down their natural gas output because their plant was targeted in an attack with either an Iranian drone or an Iranian missile. And so they stopped production both of the urea plant and of the production of liquid natural gas. So that's one of the big suppliers at the plant level that's already been taken out of the market. Now, as I understand it, other plants are still operating, but they're stockpiling. They're having to stockpile urea, presumably urea. I don't know how they store liquid natural gas or ammonia. I'm not sure you can store ammonia that easily. But I think one of the questions I saw coming up amongst engineers yesterday was if the conflict continues for beyond a few more weeks, there's a problem potentially of capacity, ability to actually store production. So you might see urea production shut down generally across the Persian Gulf, which would back into ammonia production, which would back into liquid natural gas, natural gas production. So, I think there's a pretty significant shock to the world fertilizer market. It's not totally dissimilar to what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine because of Russia's extensive access to natural gas and oil. But I think because so much urea is produced in this part of the world, and a lot of it goes into not just the United States, but into developing countries like India and Brazil, as I understand it, is a big importer of both nitrogen fertilizers and phosphate. So, of course, necessarily that's having an impact on prices, as you might expect. So this is a big supply shock, and urea prices have already increased at the port of New Orleans. I don't follow urea prices. I imagine our colleague Barry Ward follows these things in a lot more closely than I do, and maybe he's already talking about this himself. But they've gone up to $683 a ton from about $516 a ton at the port of New Orleans. And in the Middle East, everybody watches the Egyptian market. And last week, their prices hit $625 a ton, up from $484, $490 a ton. Presumably, the New Orleans price includes transport costs, but those price increases in terms of percentage changes looks pretty, pretty significant. And even though fertilizers were exempted from tariffs, the tariffs being implemented by the administration last November on both, I believe, on both nitrogenous and phosphate fertilizers, the loss of these Middle Eastern suppliers reduces the availability of import supplies to the United States. And I think it's true to say that with the Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, with the implementation of the 10, possibly 15% tariffs for 150 days on product, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with tariffs in this particular industry. And you probably saw groups like the American Farm Bureau, the National Corn Growers, and the American Soybean Association executive officers appealing to the government to continue to give carve-outs on no tariffs on fertilizers. The only fertilizer that isn't affected by this dispute in any meaningful way is potash, and we get most of our potash from Canada, about 85, and there's no tariff on that right now because it's entering the United States under the USMCA agreement. So that gives you I think that pretty much answers your question about what's going to be the effect on supplies and prices. And there are other things affecting the market that I'll talk about in my other questions that I gave you ahead of this talk.
Yeah, and I think, Ian, one of the things I'm hearing is usually when farmers are thinking of military conflict, you have a different vision. You don't visualize that, oh, there could be attacks on fertilizer plants in other countries. And of course, we know that we've heard the stories of oil tankers and that being hit by drones and that. So just that when we think of a conflict, this conflict becomes much bigger because it's impacting some of those inputs that we rely on here in agriculture. You mentioned that, but we're now in March. The weather has warmed up at the beginning of this week, so now farmers are turning their sights as for planting. Now, what impact could this have as we move into the planting season here across the state? And could it impact what's going on here, impact what farmers are going to do as far as their crop choices of crops that they're going to plant?
For sure. So, I don't follow how much farmers have been buying forward in the fertilizer market. And something I should have said a few minutes ago, the fertilizer market was already tight even before the conflict began. And importantly, and I've heard Barry Ward talk about this, that China continues to have restrictions on its exports of fertilizers. So China has been sort of hedging, not against the possibility of a conflict, but just hedging in terms of its own supplies of nitrogenous fertilizers. And of course, European producers had already cut back their production of fertilizers because of the issues relating to, the Europeans are basically backed away from cheap Russian natural gas and having to, import liquid natural gas into ports like Rotterdam. But getting back to your question, if farmers haven't bought forward, obviously there's going to be a price effect that's already going to be happening given the price at the port. But perhaps more importantly, and I guess this is kind of obvious when you think about it, if you're buying a product or importing a product into the United States that's produced in the Persian Gulf, it takes anywhere from 30 to 45 days for a vessel to be loaded in maybe in Qatar or Oman or wherever at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz and getting out into the regular trading lanes for merchant shipping. And then it takes a few more days or a few more weeks, I should say, to get that product inland into the United States, given that the Midwest is and the Corn Belt are the major areas that are going to be demanding urea and other fertilizers affected by this. So for example, I saw an article on the Corn and Wheat Growers Association had a really nice article on this yesterday or the day before, where they said, well, if it takes 30, 45 days and a little bit extra time to get it into the Midwest, that means something leaving, if something were actually leaving the Persian Gulf now, you know, it would take till about early May to get here. So I think what the people who follow these things carefully are suggesting is if you're shutting it down now and you still need to get, you know, fertilizer dressing as you're moving into the late spring and the back end of the planting season, it might be pretty difficult to get those new supplies delivered. And if not, the prices are going to be pretty restrictive. So I think that's kind of the obvious thing. It's a price and a supply issue at the same time that's related to, even if it were to open up tomorrow, there are supply logistics that are going to affect how soon that fertilizer can get to American shores. But the thing that I've been seeing online, and in fact, Morning Ag Clips this morning had republished an article that was published in Reuters, the Reuters news agency, a few days ago, where Seth Meyers, the former chief economist at USDA, was asked about this. And his view was that corn, and I'm no agronomist, so but I'm a quick learner about these things, David. Corn is much more nitrogen stroke fertilizer intensive than soybeans. And so there may be, so here's what I'm reading and understanding, that in the core corn belt, you know, where the highest yields occur, there probably won't be that much change in planting decisions is the expectation. But elsewhere, you know, maybe on the edges of the corn belt, maybe, I mean, I don't know whether you would describe, is Ohio in the corn belt or are we on the edge of the corn belt proper? How would you describe our geographic location?
Definitely on the eastern corn belt.
So in Ohio, we may see some switch to soybeans as opposed to corn. But again, I think that's going to depend on the extent to which farmers have already made those planting decisions and made their purchases of seed and fertilizer. So I think there is some expectation of a modest decline in corn plantings this year, that I guess farmers might reduce the rate of application of fertilizers, which might affect yields. So I think there's an expectation of area planted and yields might be smaller. I mean, it was a pretty good, we had a huge corn crop last year and we did very well on the export market compared to the soybean market. So I think it's an interesting calculus for farm. You know, I don't study farm management like Barry and you guys do, but I think it could have an impact which presumably would affect relative soybean to corn prices at harvest time, you know, this coming September. But Seth Meyers was definitely suggesting, and I think he probably understands this market as well as anybody, that it probably would lead to some changes in planting decisions, but perhaps more lower rates of application and hence somewhat lower yields this year in the corn sector.
Now that's on the crop sector, but are you seeing anything as far as, you know, consumers are going to have their ears perked up first because of the gasoline prices? But when we look at global food security, we look at food prices. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ian?
Yeah, I noticed in Monday morning trading yesterday, it looked like bean and corn and I think soy oil prices were up slightly. So you might, yeah, I'm not sure we're going to see quite the same impact on prices that we did at when Russia initially invaded Ukraine. If you remember, both Russia and Ukraine were, prior to the war, major producers of wheat. You know, often that part of the world was called the breadbasket of Europe. And if you remember, going back to February 2022, there was a huge spike in wheat prices, but eventually we saw adaptation to what was happening. But that required, you know, going from one season into the next. So wheat prices eventually softened, presumably as American farmers started planting wheat. I guess that would be winter wheat they were planting for harvest in early in, you know, again, I'm not an expert on these things, but I would expect, given that, you know, food prices have not been coming down that fast, that we're certainly not going to see that speeded up. So I would think there may be some, energy prices are going to pass through into transport costs, production costs. Think about our fruit and vegetable sector. That's our major import from Mexico and to some extent from Canada. You got to pump water for those fruit and vegetables. You got to pack them. You got to transport them. So I would think that this is going to be passed through into prices pretty quickly. How much? I gave you what 4% is the expected rate of inflation if oil prices continue at the kinds of levels they're at. But here you're going to get the sort of double whammy of both oil prices and fertilizer prices feeding into farmers' balance sheets. And I guess, the issue for farmers is this got a good side and a bad side. The bad side is the greater squeeze on their margins that we already know their margins are facing a squeeze. And I think economists at North Dakota State suggested that at least 9 row crops last year stood to lose $50 billion, and the $12 billion payout to farmers, which apparently has already 50% of it's already been given out. It's probably not going to be enough to cover any losses that farmers are making. So that's kind of the pessimistic side. But I guess if commodity prices actually get pushed up, and remember they're priced in dollars, commodities, and the dollar appreciated yesterday. So I think we will see an increase in food prices. I think it's a little bit early to say precisely how much, but I've already seen, there was a good article in the New York Times the other day about food insecurity globally. They thought that this would particularly affect the prices of wheat and corn, or maize, as the rest of the world calls it, as well as soybeans, which goes typically into vegetable oils, in terms of how it affects our food budgets. But they were suggesting bread prices, pasta prices. I'm not sure about rice prices. We'll have to see with rice. But clearly, the major subsistence commodities would see a price hike, and that's immediately going to affect developing countries that are importers of these major commodities, and that's going to affect food insecurity, food prices. And we know that what's happened with previous food price spikes in the early 2000s and then more recently. So I do think that's going to feed through into prices. And as the as the chat show host was suggesting this morning when I watched their speeches from last night, they all had pictures of gas station signs up showing up by how much prices have gone up. I think it's going to be very hard to hide these price increases from consumers, be it in the grocery store or on the forecourt of a gas station. So, yep. That might be a piece of positive light for farmers if it does push up commodity prices. But I still think their margins are going to be tight.
Will be a bumpy. It was predicted to be a bumpy year. Now the ripple effect of this conflict and with Iran definitely is going to continue to ripple throughout our industry. So we will continue to watch it. We're going to continue to connect with you as a farm office team to make sure we stay on top of this and what is that ripple effect as it pushes forward. Now, Ian, I want to mention before we close to the viewers that you wrote a really nice article, and we posted it this morning up on the Ohio Ag Manager blog at ohioagmanager.osu.edu, as well as the Farm Office blog, farmoffice.osu.edu. But if folks want to connect with you directly, what's the best way for them to do that, Ian?
Best to do it by email. I do religiously check my email and make sure that I'm up to date. So sheldon.1@osu.edu. But you can also contact me by phone. My office phone number is 614-292-2194. That's a digital phone, so it actually will, if I'm not here, leave a voicemail, and that pops up in my email as well. So pretty much phone or direct email will get a hold of me. Well, thanks for asking me to talk today. It's great to have. It's not really great to have got up to speed on this issue because we'd rather not have to be dealing with this issue. But one thing I didn't mention, at least I only mentioned it briefly, and that is that these 5 countries are also the big phosphate fertilizer producers. And many of them, when we produce natural gas and oil, one of the byproducts of natural gas and oil production is sulfur. And sulfur is the major input into sulfuric acid. And sulfuric acid is another traded commodity out of the Persian Gulf. And that gets used in the production of super phosphates. I think diammonium phosphate is one of them. I forget the name of the other one. And also it gets used in producing ammonium sulfate, as well as being used in the Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia. So all in all, there's a huge interconnectivity between production of oil and natural gas, the inputs that they provide for fertilizer production, and the fertilizers themselves that are being affected by this. So I think it's important to pay attention to all of those factors that are impacting ultimately on supply and on the price at the port, and ultimately the price presumably where farmers are buying these things at wholesale. So I feel like I'm giving very pessimistic news in all the talks I give at the moment. If it's not tariffs, it's now fertilizers and oil prices. So hopefully things get better over the next 12 months. But right now, as you say, things look rather volatile and bumpy.
And we just appreciate your insight to help us understand the region better, the dynamics that are wrapped into this gigantic puzzle that we call the world economy and ag economy right now. So Dr. Sheldon, we appreciate you being on with us. And I am sure we'll be meeting again and talking again about this conflict. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Lots of good wisdom and nuggets there. I'm sure that many of us are going to be watching this situation. Again, I'll have Bruce drop into the chat the connection that you can make for Ian in his email or his phone number as well, so you're able to talk. A lot of ripple effects that could happen out of the discussion here, discussion paired with what Barry had talked about with regards to fertilizer and fuel. I know there's been a lot of nitrogen already secured for this year's planting, depending what state across the Midwest, of course. I know we have some concerns from some of our hay producers in the eastern side of Ohio who have not secured their fertilizer needs for this year's forages. So we'll, as a Farm Office Live team, keep watching this. If you have Q&A, just drop that in. But now I'm going to transition for a really quick federal farm bill update, and just make sure, as long as people can see my screen. If not, I'm sure my team will tell me. But where are we as far as the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program? Just as a recap, $11 billion was allocated for assistance for row crops, another $1 billion for specialty crops. Now, I've done some research to try to find out the payments to date. According to our Farm Service Agency office, 7.1 billion of the 11 billion has already been paid throughout the United States. If we're looking specifically here at the state of Ohio, our producers to date, earlier this week, just around $219 million. And of course, for those producers who have not made application, that program's going to be open up until April 17th. Now, we were here a month ago on February 13th, and as soon as we closed that program, there was information released on the other portion, the $1 billion for specialty crops. And as with everything with the federal government, we always get a new acronym to learn. And for the $1 billion for specialty crop, that was deemed as a program called Assistance for Specialty Crop. That was announced just 1 month ago, like I said, when we were here on Farm Office Live. So I want to do a few updates on this, because today's an important date when it comes to assistance for specialty crop. A really narrow window for specialty crop producers. And sugar and commodities that aren't covered under the previous announced Farmer Bridge Assistance Program. Well, you notice that today, March 13th, 5 o'clock, is the day to report the 2025 acreage to the USDA FSA offices for specialty crop producers. So if you haven't done that, you have today to do that. Those payments are going to be based on 2025 planted acres. Now, unlike the FBA program, we don't know what those payment amounts are going to be per acres per crops, but the intention is that those payment amounts, those rates will be announced by the end of this month here in March. Just like with the FBA program, there's no crop insurance linkage. Now, we know that there are some producers here in the state of Ohio that will be eligible based on their crops, and you can see the eligible crop list there. Put in the slide deck another, this is right off the Farm Service Agency assistance program. It puts it in a little easier manner to read that, but we do have fruits and vegetables and specialty crops here across the state of Ohio that will be eligible. So we're hoping that our producers are checking into this program. Farm Service Agency office did say that just to help, if we could provide a few clarifications on some ineligible crops. Well, any dry edible bean or peas that were field peas that were covered under the FBA program, of course, would not, no double dipping allowed there. So those would not be eligible under this program. And those specialty crops that are grown in controlled environments, so think of greenhouses, think of hoop houses, high tunnels, includes hydroponics, aquaponics systems. Those specialty crops are not covered. So this is field-based crops that are covered in this. And then just some clarification that if there's specialty crops that have, based on the FSA coding, it falls under prevent plant or experimental, those crops are not eligible, as well as those commodities that we would look as more of our cover crops, our green manures, our grazing, our silage type of crops. So big day today with the fact that this program, the window was open for a month here. As far as reporting the crop acreage, know that the program is open for another month, but just know that you need to report that acreage. Another deadline that is this weekend to be aware of is the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, that NAP coverage. Usually that is due on March 15th, but March 15th is on a Sunday this year, so that rolls it to the next day, which will be Monday. So the coverage for NAP needs to be purchased by Monday, and that's for our forage crops. Usually, traditionally here in the state of Ohio, it's for our forage crops and for like sunflowers. So that NAP coverage deadline's up. Also, the Conservation Reserve Program, the USDA recently announced the enrollment programs, periods for that, for the Conservation Reserve Program. The continuous program, the enrollment is going to be through March 20th, so one more week for that. And the enrollment for the general, and in fact, on that continuous, what they're doing is they're batching those applications together. So that's why that March 20th date there that you see there. And then the enrollment for the general CRP program, Conservation Reserve Program, will be from March 9th. So it's open now through the mid part of April 17th. And then just, and finally, before we close, we want to just mention we've been in the heat of the extension programming across the state of Ohio. So today, to end, we just want to update you on a few online courses. Still plenty of time, and maybe these are some courses you can take in the evening or even from the comfort of your tractor. The first is the Planning for the Future of the Farm workshop. Robert and I traditionally will bounce around the state teaching a 2-evening program on helping people design their transition and estate plans. And those courses continue. We're in the middle of our Zoom March series right now, halfway through that. But know that we have an online course that you can take anytime, anywhere, any place, and that's self-paced. You do it at your pace, and then you'll behind the scenes be able to talk to Robert and I. Know that that enrollment is open now. It is open at any time for a person to enroll in the course for $149. Know that if you're an Ohio Corn and Wheat member, Ohio Corn and Wheat members get a $100 discount off of the course enrollment because of the generous support that Ohio Corn and Wheat provided to development of that course. Also, Bruce is in the midst of helping people on the new grain marketing online course, which was released in December of this past year. There's 12 modules in that program. You can see that we have a great team of Dr. Lee from Ohio State. We have, of course, Bruce Clevenger, Field Specialist Farm Management, as well as Grant Gardner from the University of Kentucky and Ben Brown from the University of Missouri that are all co-instructors in that class. They're in the middle of their winter session. You still can sign up, but you have to complete the course by April 15th. Probably a good time to sharpen up on those grain marketing skills. And then I want to alert you where you are in the middle of the winter session for the Farm On course, the financial management course that Field Specialist Eric Reeker leads. We have a nice class enrolled in that right now, and they will have until the end of March to finish their course. Know that enrollment is closed right now for that, but know that the next enrollment period, because there is live resuscitations that happen with that, that's going to be between July and September. So if you're interested in enrolling in the Farm On course, you're more than welcome to do it. You can go and enroll, and it will kick you out an email when the course opens for it to begin. And then finally, Peggy Hall has been part of a great team that put together and brought together the Food Business Essential course, allowing people to explore as food entrepreneurs about getting into the business, all the rules, laws, regulations. This is a super course, probably the best value you'll ever see when it comes to an online course at $25 per enrollee. Lots of information there from cottage foods all the way through meats and poultries and other products that you may be raising on the farm. And finally, your evaluation, your thoughts on today's program are always appreciated. And I ask Bruce to drop this into the chat as well. But as you exit today's program, hopefully it will take you right to it. But if not, just go to go.osu.edu/FOL evaluation. So that stands for Farm Office Live Evaluation. We always are reviewing those comments and setting the stage for our next Farm Office Live based on your thoughts. And speaking of the next Farm Office Live, know that our next webinar will be on April 17th, same time at 10 o'clock on Friday, April 17th. And then we take our pause as producers move into the field for the spring and the summer. But no, we'll be back live from the Farm Science Review on Thursday, September 24th. Make sure you have those Farm Science Review dates of September 22nd through the 24th. And don't get tripped up this year. It looks like it looks as appears on the calendar to be a week later as we just the way the year falls, but September 22nd through the 24th. We'll be back on October 16th, and then November 13th. Barry and Jeff are putting together a great tax update for us all, and then we'll close the year on December 18th. We are almost 20%, if you think about it, almost 20% of the way through 2026 already as we move into spring planting here. So folks, I'm going to stop, pause. Team, is there any Q&A or chats that we need to talk about before we close and stop the recording of today's program?
I think we're good on Q&A. I think Barry answered one online. Good to go. Thanks, David.
Appreciate everybody behind the scenes. I appreciate your patience as we, who are not very tech savvy, try to figure out technology behind the scenes of just quirks in Zoom that we never knew existed and well, until today. So we figured that out. Thank you for your patience to allow us to flip the schedule between Barry and Ian. I appreciate that Ian was able to record that as he is on an airplane right now. So we appreciate each and every one of you for being here today on Farm Office Live. And again, you can go to farmoffice.osu.edu to see the slides, the recording, and to see the rest of our information. Appreciate everyone being on.